This is very exciting. Hi, this is Dale Peterson, and welcome to the Unsolicited Response Show. My guest on this episode is Josh Corman. We talk about healthcare, SBOMs, national strategy, and a variety of things. I think you'll really enjoy this episode because we get into the details and we agree on quite a bit and disagree on quite a bit. There's a lot of nuance to these conversations and what's the best way forward. Before we get to the show and my interview, I want to remind you that the S424 call for presentations is out. We've actually accepted 4 or 5, I think it's 5 now, 5 sessions as of today, and we're getting new ones in. We review them as they come in, get you an answer back within a week. So I highly encourage you to consider, if you want to be on the stage, get your submission in, I would say in June. After June, your odds of getting in go down steadily all the way till the call for presentations closes in August. Besides that, I guess the only other piece of news is that after a bit of a hiatus, the podcast is back. I took about maybe a month off for vacation, but I've got this interview with Josh, and then I'm recording actually 4 more interviews shortly after this. So we'll have a lot of episodes in the pipeline. Joining me on the Unsolicited Response Show is Josh Corman. Josh is currently the VP of Safety Strategy at Claroty, but he's had quite a few roles in his career. Right before he joined Claroty, he spent 18 months as the Chief Strategist on the CISA COVID Task Force. And then, Josh, as I went through your LinkedIn, I saw a CTO, CSO, just about every kind of O you can imagine. So you've done a lot in the various companies. And I guess one other thing from a short bio perspective, you also are one of the founders of I Am The Cavalry, which hits 10 years old this year. So quite a lot of experience there. And a lot of things I want to talk to you about. So we're going to meander a little bit here, but maybe as a place to start, you've got this healthcare experience. You had it before you joined the task force, probably one of the reasons why you were selected. You were looking at that problem pre-task force, and now you've done that, and now you've joined Claroty, who is a traditional OT vendor, but recently made an acquisition in the healthcare space. So let's start with healthcare. We're not going to spend the whole show on healthcare, but let's start there. One of the issues I have, and to be, fully frank here, I've never worked in healthcare beyond maybe doing some IT security work back in 1999 or something like that. So I don't have that experience. But when I look at the area and I compare it to, let's say, the more traditional OT areas, electric, oil and gas, manufacturing, water, it seems to be so different than those. Is it possible to lump these all under this generic banner of OT, or do we need to start to separate different types or give it a different name or treat it differently? Or can we treat it just as here's another cyber physical system that needs to be protected in the same way as you would protect a power plant?
Wow. What a question. So I've either had the benefit or bad luck to kind of span plural critical infrastructure sectors. Mm-hmm. I teach for CMU's grad school, so a lot of the CISOs that come through are in oil and gas or hospitals or financial services. So I get to see the common ground across these cyber physical sectors and the differences, where some are stronger, where some are weaker. But also with the cavalry work for the last decade, we do engage the coalition of the willing on anything where bits and bytes meet flesh and blood. So we also get to see those differences through our, avocation or altruistic goals. And I think as the philosopher in me and looking for pattern recognition, there are a lot of common features, right? Older equipment, cyber physical equipment that can lead to harm or property damage, hard to patch, limited patch cycles. There's enough in common that I think if you squint, there are applicable and transferable lessons that we've not fully articulated or transferred. I think some of the public policy thrust is trying to do some cross-pollination across these sectors, but they're not the same. I mean, look at the Purdue model, whether it's dead or not, or dying or not, or whether we killed it on purpose for digital transformation, there's a ton that a hospital has in common with an OT environment, and yet Purdue never made its way in there. Trust zones, conduits, like levels of privilege. The hospitals opted for flat, wide open networks. They also have older equipment that can't be patched or can't be patched quickly.
Yep.
That could kill people, and yet wildly different approaches. Purdue was born for OT. Nothing like that was born for healthcare. So I try to study and understand and transfer the differences between them, but I think they have a lot more features in common than they do practices.
Yeah, in a sense, I agree with you, but I have a hard time with it. So I've done a lot of sectors, a lot of those 16 sectors, but not anything in healthcare.
Right.
But if I go into a water treatment plant or a factory or a power plant, they have many similar, sometimes the same types of equipment, actually.
Right.
Sometimes the same brand that they purchased. I mean, you'll see Emerson across water, power, and you'll see Rockwell across a lot of different things.
Schneider.
And you're talking about the same sort of thing where a kind of physical structure with a limited number of people doing a special purchase or purpose task without a lot of customers present. And then I look at healthcare, if I look at a hospital or a large doctor facility, we're talking patients walking in and out. We're talking a large number of people touching the physical systems.
Yeah.
And while I can see the similarities, I guess I worry that if we try to, as we lump more and more things together and just say, oh, this is another OT system, this is another OT system. If I were brought into a healthcare thing, I think what I would recommend would be highly different than what I would recommend in a factory.
Yeah, I mean, the nuance matters, right? There are material differences that you just cited, but there's also some common ground. I think one of the ones that's stunning to me now that the White House is calling for minimum cyber regulations for areas like healthcare and hospitals is that culture. Like, I was also a biologist, so brief sidebar. There's a lake in an island in the South Pacific with jellyfish that have no stingers.
Yeah.
They have no stingers because they had no evolutionary need to make stingers. They had no predators. And I've only recently encountered that the quote best practices in healthcare, they just don't believe in asset inventory. They think it's impossible. No one can do it. There's no value if you tried. It's the number one control in nearly every prioritized control list in the world. Sometimes it's number 1 and number 3 and number 4.
And so just to be clear, not in mine. It'd probably be like number 9.
Right.
But that's another disagreement.
But it's at least in the top 20, and it's not even on the list for a lot of hospitals. So where I was going to go, though, is, of course, I'll acknowledge your differences. I mean, one of the reasons I love speaking to you is you take positions and your good faith, and we talk about it and the nuances in between. Where I was going to go, though, is I think one of the things that's fascinating about hospitals is we talk about OT, IT convergence. Hospital is the living, breathing microcosm of the full convergence. It's got water treatment. It's got linear accelerators sometimes for radiation delivery. It's got building management systems. It's got IoT. It's got IT. It's got medical devices. It's got Schneider electric power type stuff for building management systems and the like. So you are really in a full mashup of quote convergence where a flaw in any one of those could lead to denial of patient care.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's talk a little bit. That's just something I've been struggling with as I look at some of these industries. And it's not just healthcare. I see the same issue with, let's say, a mobile fleet in mining, dealing with all the drillers and haulers and such. That's just a very different world than a factory. And I'm worried that we're starting to lump everything together and say we need to do the same thing everywhere. But let's shift now. You've claimed, and I'm not disagreeing with you, but I want to kind of enlighten the audience, but you've claimed that we've had the first fatality due to a cyber attack in the healthcare industry. Can you maybe share that with the audience?
Yeah, there were 2 seminal publications on October 1st of 2021, and one of them was ours from CISA. And since then, there have been 2 more. But we know that delayed care can affect mortality rates, whether there's cyber or not. Right. There's a seminal piece of research from the New England Journal of Medicine that says if you have a heart attack in a U.S. marathon city during a U.S. marathon, there's a statistically significant elevated mortality rate after 30 days. It's attributed to a 4.4 minute longer ambulance ride to go around the running route. So delayed integrated care affects mortality. We know that. But two things happened on October 1st, and I'll say them quickly. One is the front page of the Wall Street Journal has depicted a story from a 2019 ransomware in Alabama of a hospital. A baby was born under complicated circumstances. It was extra complicated from the lack of modern technology that they usually depend upon, and then subsequently perished. And there's a lawsuit they're probably going to settle or lose, citing that had their equipment been available, they would not have lost the baby. Number two is my team did the first statistical proof of loss of life. So if the Wall Street Journal was the first named victim, we took some data science from the CDC excess deaths, mortality rates that had strong positive correlation to ICU strain over 75%. And using that measurement instrument, we looked at the state of Vermont and we looked across a statistically significant 5-month observation period. And the counties in the same state with the same population, adjusting for hospital type and size and other confounding variables, we could see the communities hit by ransomware achieve these excess death stress levels sooner and stay there longer. So we could quantify minimum, maximum, most likely, and then corroborate that with state level evidence, such as like elevated heart, brain, and pulmonary, where minutes or hours are the difference between life and death. So both of those got testified to the Senate. And then briefly, two more have come up recently. One's a survey done by Ponemon and others that was checking sentiment analysis and belief, but talked about a whole number of factors for ransomed hospitals. And one of them was elevated mortality rates, scored pretty high, survey-based being what they are. You know, some people like that study, some people don't. But more recently, Dr. Christian Demath, Jeff Tully, and some of their colleagues published in a medical journal called JAMA, the blast radius effects that when Scripps Institute in San Diego got shut down for ransomware, it had spillover effects in quantifiable ways on the hospitals nearby that had to absorb their ambulance diversions, their stroke patients, and how quality of care suffered. So there's real measurement and quantification happening now. Instead of turning away from it, we're leaning into it. There's an increasing number of data journals and medical journals. We're past the point of debating, can someone die, to now, okay, Congress has admitted, like, we've seen loss of life, it's time to have political will.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I'm going to deviate a little bit. We're definitely going to talk about the Patch Act because you were involved in that, and I know you're a proponent of that. But based on what you said there and what we see as the incidents, it seems that ransomware is what is causing this degraded care. Almost, and in fact, we could extend that to other sectors as well. I mean, Colonial Pipeline, ransomware of the IT network. Various food systems, ransomware of the IT network. But I would expect then, if we say this is the cause, this is real data now, we've got real data that ransomware is the cause, then shouldn't we be focusing our efforts? And this is not affecting medical equipment. This is affecting traditional computers and systems for the most part, this ransomware. Shouldn't we be focusing our efforts on, hey, we need to be able to provide a level of care if we get hit by ransomware, the consequence side, and we need to be doing things to reduce the likelihood of ransomware. I mean, I would think that given the numbers, that should be 95% plus of our focus, at least in the healthcare sector.
Yeah, I'm with you. In fact, a lot of hot debate right now over what should be done for that regulation. Should it be, here's a bunch of controls that we don't know if they work or not and hope for the best? Should it be sprinkling penicillin dust over all the sick patients and assets and none of them actually have a sufficient dose to stop anything? I've been arguing for, if you'll pardon the metaphor, after 9/11, when we realized hijackers can get on planes and turn them into missiles, we didn't get rid of the legacy fleet. We couldn't get rid of the legacy fleet. And while we did a lot of stupid things as a country, one of the smart things we did is we added a steel reinforced cockpit door. So I've been asking, what are the steel reinforced cockpit doors for healthcare delivery? Because you're going to have ransoms for the next 10, 15 years, and they're going to hurt. But if you can make sure that the things that can't go down don't go down, or that your mean time to recovery is pretty fast, then people don't die. So it's these protracted multi-week, multi-month outages, unavailability of imaging, of EMR systems, of cath labs for the heart that affect the time sensitive. You may not survive to the ambulance ride to the next nearest facility, especially if you're in rural America. And I hope we actually get to talk about the recent closure at a rural hospital. But I think we need to
let's jump in there, because I mean, I'm the host, but you just asked the best question so far is what is the steel reinforced cockpit door in the healthcare system? What are the answers you're hearing to that question?
Well, to me, it's pretty obvious. You can shut off almost anything in the hospital except for the electronic medical record system. That goes down, bad things start to happen. In part because it's not electronic medical record system. It's a billing system. It's a financial system. It's an insurance system. It's almost like an inoperable tumor. We have entanglement. This is incredibly terrible, resilient design. So that everything is so independent. If you read Andy Greenberg's book, Sandworm, there's some harrowing stories in there that part of the NotPetya victims was a cloud-based voice to text dictation system called Nuance, the ones that bought Dragon Naturally Speaking. And 2 kids almost didn't get surgery because they couldn't extract that outage from the EMR system to get approval for that they were fit for surgery that they desperately needed. So there's like almost like a spy thriller section in there about how even the entanglement between voice to text dictation from doctor's notes could affect the timely access to care. The second thing is anything that related to heart or brain. So you have the golden hours for stroke. If you can't image the brain, you can't tell if it's a rupture or a clot. If it's a clot, there's a clot buster that can save brain and save life. If you give that same dosage to a rupture, they'll bleed out and die. So you need imaging. So there's a handful of critical path systems for heart, brain, and pulmonary where minutes or hours are the difference between life and death. That's your too important to fail subsystems. And if you can't afford to do segmentation isolation on everything, you can at least try to harden off those critical things. And the people that can survive a delay or a trip to a neighboring county, let them do that.
Yeah, I don't hear that a lot, though. I don't hear that. I hear more, we need SBOMs, we need vulnerability management, we need it, and all things that I don't think too many people, I'm sure there's some, but not too many people would argue against the principle of those things, that they're good things to do, good things to have. But in terms of impact over the next, 1 to 3 years, the things you're talking about seem to be a lot more. And we've dealt with this in other sectors. I remember I had one client that the company basically abandoned the ICS, and it was an early version of Windows Active Directory. Actually, it was a shift, I think, between when Active Directory was just starting and they weren't going to transition. So this company, it was in the oil and gas, natural gas industry. They had a cold standby system. They said, we cannot ensure that our system won't be compromised. So if we get hit, this is what we do. We pull out all these cables, we disconnect everything, we plug in these 3 computers. It allows us to run on a minimal basis.
Yeah.
Are they thinking about anything like that for the health records? Because they say we can't guarantee we won't be hit. How do we operate if we are hit?
So there's competing schools, and without talking out of school, let me just abstract it a little bit to give you a partial answer. The White House National Cybersecurity Strategy, even before they published, asked CISA to come up with cross-sector cyber performance goals that were the crawl stage of crawl, walk, run, the things that are foundational to any program. You could quibble if they were the right ones or not. I've told you once, I think on your stage, that they're not performance goals. Performance is a number that you can measure, and goals are smart. These are more like the crawl subset of the NIST cybersecurity framework for crawl, walk, run. It's like start here. The White House strategy essentially instructs the regulators, start with the CPGs, add sector-specific additions to it that only you and your public-private partnerships would know. So school 1 is start with the CPGs. School 2 is, the healthcare sector completely disagrees. They have this thing called Hiccup. Their best practices developed in their evolutionary branch that they like, and they have some strengths in it, and they have some blind spots in it. And they're not talking about EMRs or medical devices. In fact, they believe medical devices aren't the problem. And I disagree with them. They're part of the problem. But their school of thought is, we know better than the White House or CISA, so we're going to pick a couple of these and hope for the best. And there's other ones, if I were probably in charge of everything, I would do outcomes-based, and I look at what are the consequences. So I do consequence-driven look, and I say, A, steel reinforced cockpit doors and the time sensitive things. B, board level accountability and stimulus funding to meet those things. Like the reason we have general accounting practices trustworthy to preserve institutional trust is because Sarbanes-Oxley exists. 3, not every hospital is equally in jeopardy. Like the rural, geographically isolated hospitals are where you're going to see more pronounced loss of life because there's no proximal alternative care. So we should be a risk-based adjustment for where we give our assistance. 4, we need emergency response and rapid recovery. And some, to your point, analog overrides, maybe banks of equipment that are less connected. So if yours are all locked up, we have some. But I think there's more on my list. But the competing schools are just arguing how to solve the problem. But I think the first order question is, what are we solving for? And unfortunately, most of our best practices in healthcare are a direct result of HIPAA, high tech, and the confidentiality of records. The truth is the healthcare sector has 4 national critical functions. Protect sensitive data is the one they do, but they don't do availability of medical records, which is different than the confidentiality of them. They don't do provide medical care, which is timely access to patient care where and when you need it. They don't do support public health, which is the public health planning for regional resilience, capacity, spillover, and emergency relief. So we have regulation for the first of those 4, and most of the quote best practices are really biased implicitly to the confidentiality of records at the cost of patient safety.
Well, a lot of directions to go. I'm going to shift us a little bit here, and I think we'll come back to what you said, because I wonder if the data supports the hospital's position or the healthcare's position. But let's talk first, before we get there, about the Patch Act, which is Protecting and Transforming Cyber Healthcare Act. And this was passed, and if I were to boil it down, it was, you got to have an SBOM, and you need to have some sort of vulnerability program, some sort of coordinated vulnerability disclosure, some plan to apply patches and updates on a timely basis. Is there another leg to that? And I guess, how involved were you in the Patch Act?
Those are all different questions.
Yes.
So you've heard me speak very fondly of Suzanne Schwartz before, Dr. Suzanne Schwartz, who runs the Food and Drug Administration Center for Disease and Radiological Health, CDRH. They do the cyber stuff. She's probably one of my most cherished teammates in my life. Incredibly brave public servant who thinks like a hacker and gets the right thing done faster than you would think government would. It's kind of spoiled me. I was hoping there were more of her. So let's see. The Patch Act, the way she was governing and regulating medical devices prior to the Patch Act was a really creative interpretation, almost like a turducken, of clinical safety and intended use. So there's no cyber statute that she could rest upon. So she used guidance, and the pre-market guidance is what you have to do before you can bring a new device to market. And post-market is your ongoing post-surveillance until it's retired and taken out of commission. So we helped her take my 5-star automotive cyber safety framework, or the later version was the Hippocratic Oath of 5 things you should do to be prepared for and respond to failure. Avoid failure, take help avoiding failure, capture, study, learn from failure, contain and isolate failure, and inoculate against future failure. So those kind of became the roadmap for her embrace of pre and post market, but it's still guidance. So if you're a big, well-funded legal team and you don't want to do this, you can probably get away with not doing it. And you also can't get a budget when you're against guidance. You can get a budget against federal law. The Patch Act really said we need in statute that we can regulate the cybersecurity of a device, not the clinical effectiveness indirectly affected by cybersecurity. So it overtly gives her broad interpretation and guidance for cybersecurity deficiencies that could lead to adverse outcomes. And they specifically in the law mentioned you must be patchable. That a lot of people thought devices weren't or shouldn't be. It was never true, but now it's in the law. They should have yes, you're right, a machine-generated, machine-readable SBOM, software bill of materials. They should have coordinated vulnerability disclosure programs, putting out the welcome mat to good faith researchers so that they can learn of and respond to. So post-market surveillance, there's a bunch of stuff, a couple called out explicitly, but through her guidance, there's a lot more things like threat models and other fail-safe modes that you can read about in guidance. But by virtue of this being in the law, it's not negotiable anymore. She can be more aggressive. And also a budget came alongside it to hire, train, expedite the enforcement of these.
So this would take place when you're looking to get a device approved by the FDA. You would need this.
The beauty of the language, if you're a wonk, is that people thought this was just for brand new things, but it's pre-market. So yes, bringing new markets to be allowed to be sold. It's post-market, which means the ongoing surveillance. It's 510K, which is when you take something. It used to be a loophole, but when you take something that existed, but you make a small adjustment, this too could trigger the enforcement, and even their law enforcement capabilities, which is called prohibited acts. So they have broad use, past, present, and future. They're mostly aiming at brand new pre-market approvals and 510Ks, but they can, if they were to learn of a material deficiency that could endanger the public, they could use their prohibited act clause.
Okay. And one other question, just kind of on how this is going to work. If you apply an update, because I've read various things about this and I haven't tracked it, but if you apply an update or a patch, is there any requirement to go back to them and say, we did this, now you need to approve this, or is that an exception to making a change in a product?
Under existing enforceable guidance, not only are you allowed to patch, you need to patch, but the only thing that would trigger a reevaluation or recertification is if your patch altered your stated intended use. So a scalpel's intended use is to cut. Okay. If your patch undermines the intended use under which you were approved, you have to get reassessed. If the patch is there to preserve the functional intended use, then there's no action required other than your quality programs.
So this is where we get in.
Yeah.
You're not a lawyer. I understand that.
Nor am I the regulator, but I understand the regulations pretty well.
Okay. Yeah. So this is where we get into this tough part where I don't think I would argue with any of the intended purposes of the Patch Act. Mm-hmm. It's good to have an SBOM. It's good to have coordinated vulnerability disclosure. It's good to have these devices be patchable. But in terms of the impact, again, if we almost look back, we said ransomware is what's really affecting healthcare today and for the foreseeable future. I mean, this could change at any time. I'm not sure what we're really accomplishing with all this. We've seen, for example, I had Justine on stage when they found the problem with, I think it was infusion pumps, and they could do a hack that would show there was some problem with this. And that never actually, I don't believe we ever saw a practical example where that attack was implemented by anyone.
It was a St. Jude medical pacemaker that in the Merlin at-home system that talks to the pacemaker. Yeah, I was there at your S4 that year. I think you gave me the stage for some of the congressional task force work. So,
but you understand what I'm saying.
Yeah.
I mean, some would call it stunt hacking. I don't think it's that kind of thing is stunt hacking. It was important to show that this could be done and such. But in terms of real world impact, this is where I have a little sympathy with what you said. The hospitals, the healthcare had a different view of this, that they're saying, look, these medical devices are not a problem. They are not where we are getting hit today. This is aspirational. I think it makes sense to start going down this road, but I guess I'm having a harder time seeing how this is really going to have an impact. Maybe you need to start down this road, and in 5 or 10 years we'll need to be where we are, but it doesn't seem to be a near-term issue to me.
So a split response. One is the Patch Act went into effect March 29th. It's even more aggressively kicking in October 1st, but it's already in effect. Given that the natural evolution and matriculation of clinical medical devices is 15 years or so, it's going to take 15 years to drain the swamp. Theoretically, it's going to take longer to drain the swamp for these unpatchable, end-of-life, unsupportable devices, often naked on the internet. So this is a long view strategy, right? We're bending the arc of history with something like the Patch Act to ratchet up how defensible the equipment we purchase and procure and deploy and manage and operate is. We want to have a good starting point. Like, Jen Easterly loves to say MFA, et cetera. Like, how do you operationally do MFA when the technology you buy can't even do single factor authentication? So we're trying to make more defensible, secure by design, secure by default equipment in the forward pipeline. So that's answer one. Answer two, and maybe you and I'll disagree on this, but I teach CISOs and I look at different environments, and we have this notion. I'm looking at my front door, okay, in my house. There's a front door to my house. There's a back door to my house. There's a basement door. There's a garage door. There's a whole bunch of first floor windows. And picture none of them have doors on the door frames. And I, as a part of the data science community and everything, I reject the notion that, well, we should look at where we're being hit. If we just put a door on the front door frame, all the burglars in the neighborhood come through the front door. If we just put a lock on the door frame, a door on the door frame and lock it, we'll be okay. But there's still no door on the back door, side door, basement door, or the first floor windows. There's a plethora of ways in. And I think we should stop looking at which way did they get in that time and play whack-a-mole and fight the last war. And what we should be doing is consequence-driven analysis of which systems need the steel reinforced cockpit door, irrespective of how they got in. How do we prevent the most costly or high impact failure modes? And how do you have resilience and asymmetric investment on those? Now, the second part of that as well is not just fighting the last war. It's that I continue to hear people claim that medical devices don't get hacked. That is demonstrably false. I personally helped in the incident response for pretty large swaths of medical device compromises during the pandemic. There are public examples of this as well. You saw mostly they'll hit email, mostly they'll hit EMRs, but there were, even during WannaCry, some of those medical devices get hit. They're running Windows XP, Windows 7, sometimes Windows 98. Why would you explicitly exclude them? So if you are a medical device, just because the preponderance of data showed mostly our workstations are getting hit last year, why would you leave? Do you think an indiscriminate port scanner cares if it's a medical device running XP or a workstation running XP? That device could get hit. And if that hit happens to be one of those heart, brain, or pulmonary time-sensitive systems, I care more about the impact to clinical patient care than I do about how we got hit last year or the year before. And furthermore, I think one of the blind spots they have is they say, well, when incident response people come in, they're not seeing the point of entry be a medical device. And I say, guys, many of the hospitals have rules against touching the medical devices for forensics. Many of them don't have any forensic evidence capture or logging to shake a stick at. And other tools, even the tools like Medigate, show plenty of signs of compromised medical devices pretty often, beaconing to malicious domains, command and control channels, and the like. So I think it is a belief that seems to be fairly entrenched that medical devices can't and don't get compromised. And I'd like to make sure that they're at least more resilient if the adversaries turn their attention to them with more force, especially if they're the ones that are heart, brain, pulmonary, or critical time sensitive.
Well, I think if we were looking for a place of agreement, I think what they're doing via the Patch Act, especially for new systems, makes sense. Because I ran into this situation. I started in OT security in 2000, and we had I kind of put the birth of it at 9/11. That's when people said, oh, we need to start looking at unconventional ways they might come at us. And we had this insecure by design problem with PLCs that has gone on. But we heard it'll take decades. We heard it'll take decades in 2002, or it'll take a decade. But we didn't start. So then we got to 2012 and we still hadn't started, and we did Project Basecamp and we still didn't start. We finally about 2016 started. So in a sense, if it's a 15-year problem, as you said, or longer, it makes sense to start. Whether it will actually have much of a degree or an impact on the consequence or the impact of cyber attacks or reduce cyber risk in the near term, I guess I'm less optimistic than you are. But there is a flip side to this, and that is, and this is another reason why the hospitals might be a little worried. I mentioned in my Explore Mini keynote an example that Gene Spafford gave in his book. Got to get the title here right, Cybersecurity Myths and Misconceptions, which came out earlier this year. But he shared an example where some hospitals were hit. There you go. You probably have it signed even, because Gene was down there at S4. But he had an example where,
and Patty, the illustrator,
and Patty was down there as well. Yes, But his example showed where a certain set of hospitals were hit. They put in additional security controls in those hospitals, and they delayed those security controls were shown to have delayed the time for someone to get an EKG by 2.7 minutes, which increased the death rate by 0.36%. And you have kind of lived the flip side of this.
Yeah.
In that CISA COVID Task Force, my guess is things were accelerated. Maybe some of the rigor that would normally be done to get a vaccine out was, handled differently. It wasn't the same process. And that was, hey, we can save more lives by moving faster. So how are we going to deal with this, if this process through the FDA delays things more? If we add additional time, it's a hard question, but I think it's a bigger issue in healthcare than a lot of the other sectors that I look at.
Yeah, and I'm a nuanced person just like you. I liked your remarks during that. If time is the critical variable for patient care, then we're doing it right when we reduce delay, man-made or ransomware introduced delay, and we're doing it wrong when we elevate delay, right? Like we can optimize fit for purpose for the types of things that are latency sensitive, latency insensitive, and the like. So we should be intelligent and not just say this best practice is always the best in every circumstance in every industry. I think that's facile. I don't assume that the Patch Act will introduce delay, by the way. In fact, some of the early adopters, like Johnson & Johnson, she gave them a perk a couple of years prior, where she said, if you have a coordinated disclosure program and you can mitigate an issue in 30 days and fix it in 60, then we won't get involved as a regulator. So you didn't have to do this. And J&J in the room said, there's no way we could do it. It takes 90 days just to do our quality process. There's no way we could do this. This is impossible. And at dinner that night, I said, what would have to be true for you to hit this perk? And we talked it through. And I said, Microsoft does automated regression testing on all their code nightly. Like, could you change your software development lifecycle? They brought in DevOps consultants. They started doing CI/CD pipelines on FDA-approved medical devices, and they got it down to 15 days. The quality is higher. The profitability is higher. The number of products they can concurrently field is higher. And if they have a Log4j or a known exploited vulnerability affecting them in the wild, they can actually patch it instead of having to replace it. So I think the people that were brought to the line kicking and screaming, they're starting to get some of the benefits for modernizing their architecture, their threat model, their update process. I'm sure there's a learning curve, but the FDA is not interested in delaying life-saving treatments from getting to market. And there's always exceptions and waivers and things like that. But I think it's forcing more modern design, development, and maintenance.
Well, this is a good pivot to SBOM, because I think I would make the same argument with the SBOM, that I wasn't worried about delay so much on the supplier side in development. That I agree with you completely. Once they start doing these things, they're going to find that things are going to be better, more efficient. They're going to have less problems as they move to modern development practices that have been proven in all sorts of other industries and just hasn't been done in a variety of the industries we deal with. So that's not a problem. And I would say the same thing with an SBOM, that as the vendors start to require one internally, they're going to get significant benefits from that. What I was worried more with the delay would be the regulatory delay, that now you've got to clear these cyber hurdles with the regulator, and that could add delay. But it doesn't sound like you're worried about that.
No, there's 3 exceptions on SBOM, and without doing the entire talk here, my talk at RSA conference was called The Opposite of Transparency. It's public now. You don't have to have a subscription or whatever. Maybe I'll give you a link. For the most part, generating SBOMs is not hard. In fact, many of the build tools and software development pipelines spit them out as a byproduct of making software. Git, Jenkins, Amazon just announced S3 buckets will do it as an export built in. So like creating them isn't the hard part. The part that people are
hold on there for a second, because I watched that talk, and I should say I also watched your interview with Paul Roberts, where you called yourself jokingly as the daddy of SBOM public policy, I think it was. And I thought that was great because I know you've been in this for a while. But I talked to Matt Wickhouse of Finite State.
Yeah.
And one of the things that they're doing and some of these other companies are doing are helping vendors create SBOMs.
Yeah.
And I came at it the same way you did. I said, why would a vendor need help creating an SBOM?
On older,
they have the build.
Yeah.
Well,
yeah.
No, he didn't say it was that. He said it was that about 80% of the build they're seeing are of components.
Yeah.
That they don't have the SBOM for those components. So they can create an SBOM of everything that they purchased and put in. But they said that means that about 80% of the elements of the SBOM aren't in there because they're largely built up on, let's say, some sort of protocol library that they bought from someone else, and they don't have the SBOM for that. Are you seeing something different with that, or is that not an issue?
This would take probably a lot more than time than you want to go through. But one of the articles of faith we use in the SBOM work is we're all in a supply chain. Most of us are in the middle. We have upstream and downstream suppliers. And as every single contributor in that relay race is still using modern tools, everybody's getting visibility, passing those up. They're combinatory, they're machine generated, machine readable, standard formats. They can be combined, disambiguated. So that light will dawn gradually over the whole. And a lot of open source communities like Java, like you get the entire dependency graph just from your Jenkins build, for the most part. Now, the middle ground between what he said and what I'm saying is, if one of your components or dependencies has not yet made an SBOM with one of those tools, if it's legacy, if it's really old and unsupported, if it's a real-time operating system or embedded system, you do benefit from some of these things. In fact, some of the methods used by like the finite states and NetRises of the world are superior, right, to some of the other methods. So we even have a types document now that was published by the tooling working group at CISA around the time of RSA conference. So different methods at different points in the SDL have different strengths and weaknesses. But I'm not a SBOM purist that there is one definitive correct SBOM. I know one of the findings from your SBOM hackathon or whatever you did at S4 was people came up with different answers. And I said, looking at the tremendous value we get out of log files, we don't have even international. We have more standards for SBOM than we do for log files. And yet we can still extract value and meaning from verbose or unverbose, or any transparency is better than no transparency. And over time with tooling, they're becoming more precise or more consistent. But like simply knowing log4j is or isn't present in the code base is meaningful and actionable when time matters. So I think we're on a journey where currently many people are benefiting from the use of those fingerprinting tools and reverse engineering tools. And a lot of the net new cloud native stuff, this is just a byproduct of doing code. Like you write your code, you get answers.
I'm inclined to agree with you, though, that the pulling it apart and creating an SBOM, a third party creating an SBOM, it's a moment in time product. It's not something we're going to get to the point where you're going to have to create it. The person that down this supply chain, they're just going to have to create it and share it through an agreed upon format. We're there. But where are we today? Do you think that most OT vendors have an SBOM in a machine readable format? How far along are we?
Let me pull a couple things together before we completely pivot.
Sure.
You asked me how my involvement in SBOM, in the Patch Act. It's basically the same as my involvement in SBOM. My very first day briefing Congress was January 7th of 2014. My very first briefing was on the need for some sort of supply chain visibility because they were asking, is healthcare.gov hackable or not? And I could prove that it was because I was the CTO at Sonatype and I could see how many unmitigated CVSS 9 and 10 flaws were in the code base. But my second briefing was pitching the 5 things that ultimately won in the Patch Act. My very second briefing, January 7th, 2014,
So you must have just been thrilled when that passed. I mean, you had
my God,
like 8 years of work in that.
Almost 9. It was 2 weeks shy of 9 years.
Oh my goodness!
And the woman that I briefed, I don't want to tell too much of her story, but she told me, she laughed at me in the meeting, and I'm like, am I doing this wrong? Is this only my first day in Congress? Like, did I make a mistake? And she goes, no, I think your idea is great. It's just going to take a decade. So when it happened, I called her. I'm like, beat you by a year.
Nice.
It's not just me. I mean, Kevin Fu and
Oh,
Suzanne,
yeah.
a whole lot of people helped, and that congressional testimony last May really put it over the edge.
Cool.
Senator Cassidy deserves a Purple Heart for fighting to the death on that one and winning. But so that was the timeline. Is I was kind of introducing them both around the same day.
Okay.
Actually, literally the same day. But to this point here, how we're doing, I love to quote that William Gibson thing. The future is here already. It's just not evenly distributed. The financial services guys under Topo Bravo Paul did a DevOps Enterprise journal. I mentioned it in my transparency talk. They compared 10 financial services cohort companies, 3 different cohorts, one with SBOMs and CICD, one with just CICD, and one with neither. And they had material differences in the benefits for timeliness and response in the SBOM column versus the other 2. Number 2, Cassie Crossley and Schneider Electric people, Meg Sanford, they have publicly stated they have 4,000 SBOMs and counting in one of the 2 supported standard formats. So this is doable even in OT, ICS land. But other industries are really behind. We just had Charlie Hart from Hitachi. He's helping to drive the automotive proof of concept version 3 for the auto ISAC. They have over $1 trillion of automakers and suppliers participating in this thing. They're all in because I stole the SBOM idea from Deming and Toyota supply chains in the 40s. So they already treasure bombs. They're just applying bombs to their software now, bill of materials. So other areas are way behind. There's a bit of a, I think in the middle is DOE, and Ginger has got a nice POC going in the Department of Energy. But there are some people that still think this is impossible to do, and they're going to drag their feet as long as possible. And it's a little self-fulfilling for the people that say, how do I get going? They find a way. And for the people that said this is impossible, they're going to be years behind. We just did SBOM-Arama 2.0. It was recorded last Wednesday. Yep. So you can see Charlie's update from healthcare, a financial services update, an energy update, and Japan is going full steam ahead as well. We had that one wasn't recorded though, but the slides are available from the Japanese government.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I've written about this. I can see, again, it's almost like what we talked about with the Patch Act in terms of having a coordinated vulnerability disclosure. I can see why the vendors should have SBOM. It's going to help them. It's not something that, and it's provable. I mean, we've seen this across the industries that have done this. So I don't think there's any doubt on that. And I've written that asset owners today, when they have an RFP, they can include SBOM requirements in there, just like they used to include software development lifecycle requirements. Are you doing fuzzing? Do you have a threat model? I didn't even care to go into detail. I just wanted to see that they were doing it and they had the artifact. So you could go in your RFP today and you could say, do you have an SBOM? And you could look at it for a few versions back. You could, if you wanted to, scan it to see if they have ancient code. But even if just you could see the artifact, that would be of value. Where I'm having a tougher time in OT is how the asset owners would use this in the next, let's say, 3 years. Because we're dealing with, you mentioned Log4j. Log4j was not an issue in OT, in traditional OT. I don't know about healthcare, but in traditional OT, the only reason it was an issue was executives said, we need to know everything that has Log4j in it. Not because of the risk of Log4j running inside that perimeter where everything was insecure by design. And, Log4j would be the hardest way to cause a problem in an OT network if you got there. So I guess I'm having a little tougher time with the push down to the asset owner side of SBOMs.
And don't overbind. Well, a couple of answers, but before I forget to say it, don't overbind to Log4j. Urgent 11 was in a ton of real-time operating systems in OT environments. Even more so, it had to have a second reveal because initially they thought it was a handful and it turned out to be a lot more. So that October of that year, they had to release an update to it. Ripple 20, I think, had some OT implications as well. So Log4j is the easy one to talk about, but there's plenty more. So what we want to do is the primary dumbest use case that I used to say is when there's an attack, can you do a text search in your assets to see, am I affected? Where am I affected? As opposed to months. One of the hospitals I work with, I mentioned it during the RSA talk, she had within 48 hours, about 40% of her vendors could answer if they were affected by Log4j for her medical equipment. Over a year later, she still doesn't have an answer from the rest of them. So like the ability to do quick impact analysis, say, should I shut this off? Should I mitigate it? Should I make a risk decision based on my known exposure? So the am I affected, where am I affected questions are the base floor. But we've even found one smaller than that, which is that a ton of these device makers have no idea what's in their code, and they don't even own their source code. They paid a Chinese firm to write it. They got a binary. They never look back. So during procurement and acquisition, we're seeing one of the ways to do this is on your forward equipment. If your device maker doesn't know what's in it, they're not likely to give you a prompt and agile patch or update.
Sure.
So it's really Sunil Yu, when he was at Bank of America, now he's at Jupiter One. He started using this not to evaluate the contents of an SBOM, but he would ask for one. If you didn't have one, he would demand a 20% discount off the top.
Nice.
Until and unless you started providing one. And eventually they started using it for things like prohibited technology lists, like certain known exploited vulnerabilities or certain bad libraries or certain things that they knew were end of life. But generally speaking, I think the uses will emerge over time, but people aren't being jerks about it. They're asking for one to make sure you know what's in your code. They might want to do a quick search in case you go out of business and they can't ask you a question later. But generally speaking, the tools are getting better when you can just search and do things and prioritizations. Like we have asset inventory stuff in my day job, the ability to import an SBOM. You look at a medical device now and you can see there's Windows XP on it.
Mm-hmm.
There's 100 CVEs associated with it. You might fix the top 9s and 10s. I'm not a fan of CVSS based patching, by the way. But now you might import an SBOM. You might see that there's over 1,000. Billy Rios famously found 1,444 in a Pixis device. But now we're starting to be smarter about this and say, what are the known exploited vulnerabilities?
Yeah.
Let's look first. What are the EPSS, the exploit probability scoring system ones that correlate to exploitation? Let's maybe look at those. And I think it's just an information layer that makes your asset inventory management better, your limited patch prioritization better, your purchasing decisions better. And there are some products that I was briefed on, they're startups, but they're looking at measuring and governing vendors over time. Like, what was your mean time to patch versus others? What was the quality of the patch? I know in OT, we don't patch as often, and patching is over-rotated on. But for the ability of vendor response times, you're starting to do who's worth your money for future acquisition and purchasing.
Yeah, I think that if I'm an asset owner, and I've written a little bit about this, I see that there's going to be a middleman in this marketplace where, as an asset owner, I don't want to have all the SBOMs. That's just a nightmare for me to try to track these and update these. Maybe I have an asset inventory and I have an ability to query some service or some set of services that gives me answers. So as an asset owner, I don't really want your SBOMs. I want to know you have them. I want to know they're accurate. I want to know your response times. But please don't give me all that data. That information layer you talk about is going to drown me if I try to hold it in my hands.
Just like an ingredients list on food, most purchasers ignore it. They never look at it even once. But if you need to, because you have an allergy, you can. I think these will mostly be ignored.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we've been talking. I knew this was going to be a while because you and I. It's funny. I agree with a lot of what you say, but there's some that I think we come down on the other side. So this was going to be a good conversation. But we've got a few minutes left here, and I've been hogging the direction of this. Is there something that you want to talk about in this? It could be the national cybersecurity strategy. It could be SBOMs. It could be more healthcare. Is there an issue that you want to talk about with the time we have left?
Wow. They're probably too big. One thing, maybe just to start the conversation but not finish it. I read something you wrote after Dole got hacked, for example, about food supply, right?
Yes.
And you saw on your stage you gave me, I said, when everything is critical, nothing is critical. So we do a poor job at prioritizing, stratifying critical infrastructure.
Mm-hmm.
I can't remember what you wrote at the time, but I remember having a reaction. I got to talk to Dale about that because here's a very short preview of what I'd love to talk about some other time, even if it's privately.
Okay.
When I look across the 16 critical infrastructure sectors, they're not all equal. And when I look across 55 national critical functions, they're not all equal. And if people watch the recording that you posted, you always do good production. I suggest that there's less than 10 of those national critical functions are life safety, latency sensitive, that if you shut them off for 24 to 48 hours, people die. And we should put the lion's share of our focus on those. And these are things in the vicinity of water and wastewater, food supply, emergency care, electricity, but not equally applied. I showed that they're important on their own, but also they really depend on each other. You don't have clean water, you can't do a hospital, you can't scrub it, you can't keep it hydrated, you can't do laboratory tests. Food is one of those that terrifies me. And also when you realize the area that you have narrowed down from 55 to 10, these are not only inherently cross-sector, they're among the least sophisticated public-private partnerships between government custodians and private sector leadership. In fact, up until someone declared there was a food ISAC out of nowhere, it wasn't out of nowhere. They had a special interest group in the IT ISAC. There was no food ISAC until about a month ago. So if we had credible intelligence to warn the ecosystem, there was really no effective way to tell anybody outside the small membership that they currently enjoy. So zoom out and take cyberwave for a minute. We are already having food supply risks from a couple of macro things. Reverse globalization is happening, whether you called it that or not. Number two is there's been really high concentration of risk through mergers and acquisitions. Using a food pun, it's more eggs in fewer baskets. There's been surprise climate things, whether it's flooding or droughts or hurricanes or whatever, right? Changes in some weather patterns can disrupt total yield. But then you add this man-made hazard of ransomware, and while there have not been a ton, the IT ISACs, now food ISAC, has over 100 that they know of. Many of you saw JBS meats, which is like a fifth to a quarter of the meat packing for the Americas. Some people saw Pilgrim's Pride or Dole. During the pandemic, I was terrified by Americold. Americold is cold storage all across the country, pretty dominant cold storage way station for lots of food products. And when you shut these things down, you have spoilage, you have disruptions. Sometimes it's just elevated prices. Other times it's like stuff is not on the shelves. And I'm pretty concerned that from farm to factory and factory to fork, there's a ton of exposed hyperconnected things on Shodan, whether it's sprinkler systems and irrigation, whether it's grain elevators, whether it's cold chain, whether you can turn the heat up in a chicken coop and kill all the chickens, as in that Wired article. We are wildly underinvested, and we have been lucky in that there's not been a lot of attack activity. But if they turn their attention from healthcare to food, this isn't just money we're going to lose. This is like pretty concentrated risk of food supply. So when Dole got hit, I think you're saying it's just one company. Who cares? And the longer they're down, the more it could happen if they're 30% of something we need. And that one might be tolerable. I don't think we would disagree on what I'm about to say, which is, well, I don't think every participant in the food sector is critical infrastructure or SICI or systemically important critical infrastructure. We do have some choke points and some concentration of risk in certain areas that are quite perilous. And I would not want us to throw the baby out with the bathwater. I think we should be precise about which attacks on the food supply can do significant harm and amplification of harm. But we shouldn't over-rotate that just because there's an attack on one of them means it's the sky is falling. So I don't think you're being throwing the baby out with bathwater, but a lot of people interpreted your post as food's not that big a deal. I kind of like to eat, and I'm kind of concerned about the cascading effects of grain shortages from Ukraine or other things.
Yeah. I think that's fair, and we're definitely going to have to do a part two.
Okay.
I would say that one of the things that I think we do, because we live in this world, right? I don't know about you, but I spend most of my time in my professional life on dealing with OT cyber risk.
Yeah, right.
And I think because we live in this world, we tend to think that risk is much greater than it is compared to other risks. Because if I'm in charge of a country or an organization, I have to deal with all the risks.
Yeah,
if I'm on the board.
Yeah.
And the agriculture example, pests and disease are much bigger systemic risks than ransomware. I mean, we had we had COVID, right? I mean, I was funny, even during COVID, there were some surveys, and this is why I'm a little skeptical on surveys. What's the biggest risk you're worried about? And cyber was number one. It's like, we're living through COVID, and cyber is your number. The boards are all saying cyber's the number one risk during COVID with all the supply chain issues and all that. So
Yeah.
I think that, and this is really a challenge. I don't know how the government deals with this, because so much of what is considered critical infrastructure could be critical if the whole infrastructure goes down. But if small parts of it go down, it's a bad day. It might be kind of tough for some
It might just be
people.
money. Might just
It
be
could
money.
just be money. Yeah, it could be a lot of things. But I think this knee-jerk reaction, this is an attack on our critical infrastructure, sends us down the wrong road and has us lacking that priority that we need to actually accomplish something. And I don't think you disagree with that. But that was my point with Dole, is even if we got no fruit for Dole for 3 years, the world would be okay. We would not all die because we didn't get fruit from Dole.
So once I got out of CISA, I started getting much closer to the food sector and food safety and some of the choke points and the ball bearings. If you remember my talk about, the ball bearings, there's more concentration risk than I am comfortable with. And if I talk to you more about it, then you would be comfortable with. And if those things get disrupted by accident or intentionally, it would be very bad.
I think that's fair. And I think if you were, when I hear you say that concern, so then I would say maybe it's not cyber risk that's our biggest risk. Maybe it's the concentration.
I completely agree. In fact, I've been working with Congress on this is the Farm Bill year. And one of the top things I was saying is we need a fresh analysis of concentration of risk from all hazards in the nation's food supply from the following factors. Because I know we're out of time, so I'll be very brief on this. Most of the medical supplies that we were tracking during the pandemic, everyone on paper had surge suppliers and backup surge suppliers. On paper, we had tons of supply chain resilience. Unfortunately, when you connect the dots and you pull the thread, almost everyone's surge supply for nitrile gloves was the same exact manufacturer in Malaysia that got hit. So someone moved the cheese, and a lot of our prior assumptions, let me end on quoting the late great hacker Dan Kaminsky, but he said of the many things that hackers break and smash, perhaps the most important is assumptions. And that's where my heart is right now. Is cyber is a hazard. It's a man-made hazard. And thanks to our insecurity, it's an on-demand triggerable man-made hazard.
True.
It is not the lead actor, but it may be material enough in the margins to be the tipping point, like that hospital closure in Illinois. So what I'd love us to do is have cyber integrated into an all hazards analysis and really give us a good reason to do fresh risk analysis and be surgical about where we place our defenses in our risk prioritization, instead of just best practices, uttering things like zero trust and whatnot. We have a role to play. And I think as more harms are manifesting, we got to get past our own cliche and our own baggage and start to really help shore up the things that are too important to fail.
I think that's a great place to press pause until part 2. Josh, thank you so much, Josh Corman, for being on the show. We've been posting up, for those watching the video, your LinkedIn is @Josh Corman. If someone wants to follow you, where are you most active these days? Your Twitter is @Josh Corman.
Right.
Where are you most active?
I've been pretty busy lately, so I haven't been very active at all, but I'm still on Twitter. I added the same handle to Blue Sky, but I haven't figured it out yet. I'm on a couple of the other ones as well, but just probably Twitter for now.
And how about speaking? Are you going to be on stage anytime soon?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a lot of feels around this, but the Cavalry's 10th birthday is August 1st. So I'm the opening keynote for B-Sides Las Vegas. We were born on August 8th, I guess, because it's a week later than normal. And we were on the 2-day track for our decade birthday of the Cavalry track. Lots of cyber physical systems for all your listeners.
Well, as you know, we had a lot of kind of depressing talk, we need to do better here, there, and whatever, but that's at least 2 causes for celebration. You got the Patch Act passed after 9 years, and the Cavalry is still charging after 10 years. So congratulations.
Thank you.